I'm Portland City Commissioner Dan Saltzman, and I'm also the chair of the Children's Levy Allocation Committee. And I'd like to welcome you to today's Portland Children's Levy Allocation Committee meeting. And I'm going to begin by introducing my colleagues with me this morning. On my far right is Alyssa Kinney-Geyer, who is the City of Portland appointed representative, citizen representative. And next to me on my immediate right is Adrienne Livingston, who is the appointed by Multnomah County as their citizen representative. On my far left is Ron Beltz, representing the Portland Business Alliance. And soon to fill the seat on my left will be Multnomah County Commissioner Deborah Kafori, who is on her way. I'd also like to introduce the staff of the Portland Children's Levy. Director Lisa Pellegrino, who is in charge of after-school and mentoring programs. Meg McElroy, who oversees the early childhood development investments. Lisa Hansel, who supervises the foster care and child abuse prevention and intervention investments. Communications Director Mary Gay Broderick, and Fiscal Specialist John Kelly. And before we get started, I'll give a bit of background on the Portland Children's Levy for those who may be watching this morning on cable TV. The Portland Children's Levy was created by voters in 2002 and overwhelmingly renewed by voters in 2008. The Children's Levy annually provides about $10 million to support organizations reaching 16,000 children and their families through program investments in early childhood, after school and mentoring, child abuse prevention and intervention, and helping children in foster care succeed. The levy operates with a 5% administrative cap, so that 95 cents of every dollar goes directly to proven programs that achieve positive results for children. We have also extended the levy's reach through our leverage fund, which matches public dollars with private ones to make more resources available for programs helping the city's most vulnerable residents. 9 organizations received $2.5 million in leverage fund grant investments, where organizations had to secure matching financial support from other community partners in order to obtain these leverage funds. So back to today's business, we need to begin first by approving our minutes of our June 6th meeting. I think you all have those in front of you.
I move we approve.
Second.
Okay. Moved in second. All in favor, say aye. Aye?
Aye.
Okay. Next up, we always have a public comment period where we set aside time for anyone who wishes to speak to us about topics related to the Children's Levy. So is there anybody in the audience that wishes to address us? Okay, I don't see anybody coming forward. So our first item is a presentation on our 2009-2010 Portland Children's Levy independent audit. The levy is annually audited for various compliance measures and to honor our pledge to voters that our administrative rate is kept at 5%. So we're pleased today to welcome Susan Marks from McDonald Jacobs, who will speak to us about the findings. Welcome, Susan.
Good morning. I would like to...
Maybe pull the microphone up a little bit. Yeah, great.
Great. Just want to correct you. It is for the 2010-2011 audit.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Not a problem.
Sorry.
So I'm with the accounting firm McDonald Jacobs. I'm a principal. And the manager on the audit is joining me. He has lost his voice, so he's just observing. But what we do as part of the compliance audit is we look at internal controls and compliance issues. And we had our field work in late October and early November. And what we do is update our understanding of internal controls. We also test those controls and then report on those controls that we tested and include any recommendations that we have. And in terms of compliance, we look at both the grant disbursements and administrative disbursements. And for administrative expenses, we selected 25 expenditures to test. And we looked to see that those expenditures were supported by documentation, that they were considered ordinary and necessary, and that they were approved. And we had no exceptions. And in terms of another test that we do is we want to make sure that administrative expenses do not exceed 5% of cumulative tax revenues, and the children's levy was in compliance with that. For the grant testing, we selected 25 grant disbursements, and we compared to grant documents and approved budgets. We examined supporting documentation. We looked to see that those disbursements were approved, and we also reviewed files to see that grantee progress reports were submitted. And again, no exceptions noted. In terms of looking at internal controls, we looked to see if the controls that are in place are being complied with, as well as looking to see if there could be some controls added to add a little more strength to those controls. And we had actually one recommendation this year. The staff is very good about documenting all external invoice processing, but internal invoice processing, we recommended that that review be documented to the extent that the external invoice process is, and the staff immediately adopted our recommendation. And that's my report, and are there any questions?
So you mentioned you selected 25 different disbursements by the levy and basically verified that they were in fact spent the way they were intended to.
Correct. Supported, approved.
And the documentation for, was it internal invoices? That was your recommendation?
Correct.
Better documentation of that.
Documentation
internal within the
of
city?
the review process. So they were being reviewed. It just there was no initials supporting that. So we recommended that, and that was immediately adopted.
Okay. And we've kept under our 5%
Yes.
administrative rate cap. Okay. Anybody else have any questions? So clean bill of health.
Clean bill of health.
Okay.
And our thanks to the staff at the Children's Levy. They're very cooperative and have excellent records and are very attentive to our questions and making sure we have what we need for the audit.
Well, great. And I believe this audit is available on our webpage, portlandchildrenslevy.org, if people want to read it. Thanks, Susan. And do you want to give us the name of your voiceless colleague so we can...
Gerard DeBlois.
Okay, thank you, Gerard, too, for your work. Thank you. So next we have John Kelly, our fiscal specialist, who will give us a brief overview of the financial cuts the levy saw this year and discuss anticipated revenue reductions in the coming year as well.
Good morning. I'm actually going to start with a follow-up to what Susan just talked about, is a report on the revenues and expenses from last year. So you have a piece of paper with a lot of numbers on it. And I'll just go through that briefly. So this is the year that ended in June. The June just passed.
So let me just make sure we have the orange piece of paper.
Yes, orange. And on the back are some notes, but I'll go through those. So I'd like to draw your attention to the revenues. $12.9 million is the top number. That's what we brought in through current year and prior year tax revenues and interest on the balance of the fund. The next number that accrued from July 1, 2003, so from the beginning of the levy through the beginning of last year, was just over $6 million. So that's the fund balance. That's what we were earning interest on, and it's money that we hadn't spent prior. So that gave us about $19 million to spend during the year. The grants that you all approved that were dispersed during the year were $14.4 million. And there you can see below how they were distributed through the 5 program areas, about $4.9 million in early childhood, and that includes the special $2.7 million early childhood project. I believe about $1 million was spent on that last year. So that's included. Also included in these numbers are the leverage fund grants that we put them in the various areas they're in. After school programs was about $3.3 million. Child abuse prevention and intervention about $2.6 million. Mentoring programs $1.7 million. And foster care about $1.9 million. And that's the first year we spent money. No, it's not. It's the second year we spent money on foster care. So this is year 2 of the current 5-year levy that we're talking about. One note on the revenues, the $12.9 million, that was 1.3%, about $164,000 more than the city economists projected. And those projections come out in January of the before the year starts. So he did a good job. You can see 1.3% on revenues of $12.9 million is pretty accurate. So on administration, last year we spent $560,000, and that was 9% below budget. So we came in well under budget. And Susan just noted that we were under the cap on administrative expenditures. The number I have is about 4.8%. That's over the life of the fund. So since the beginning of the fund through the end of last year, June 30th, 2011, we spent about 4.8% of revenues on administrative expenses. So the encumbered funds at the bottom of the report, they're $4 million. So that is funds that we carried forward into this year. So we started the year with about $6 million in fund balance. We ended the year, or began this current year, with about $4 million in fund balance. So that's a significant number to know about. And so you see the $19 million is it's not total expenditures because $4 million was held onto. And there at the bottom is that 4.8% figure. Our grant spending, the $14.4 million, was about 94% of budget. And that's real typical for the levy over the history of the levy, that about 95% of budgets get spent. The way our spending works is the grantee agencies invoice us for money they've already sent out the door, dollars they've already spent. So they can only invoice us for money that they've spent. So they can't just approximate, we think we're going to spend this. They have to actually have spent it, and that number came up to 94% last year. Any questions on last year? I'll speak briefly to the internal invoicing situation. That's things like ordering paper. We ordered a new printer. It's that kind of stuff. We document it thoroughly. I know about it. BTS knows about it. It goes through the city systems. What we're going to do now is Lisa's going to review that line by line and say, yes, I looked at it. She knows about it. It was more a formalization of a process. Any questions about last year? All right. That was good. This year, not as good. So now we're on to this sheet. I can't remember what color it is. It says at the top,
Yellow.
Reduced revenue projections and grant reductions.
Yellow, right? This one?
Yellow, yes. Okay. So now we're into this year. It started July 1st, 2011. It goes through June 30th. So as I said, the city economist in January gives us a number of what, it happens to be a guy, Josh Harwood, what he thinks we will bring in during the year. And that this year was off. And
I'm sorry, this is for the current fiscal
year. The year that we're in, yeah, we're about halfway through, not quite
fiscal 11-12.
11-12 in January.
Halfway through right now.
As I'm putting the budget together, Josh says, I think you're going to have this much revenue.
Okay.
Well, that's before the taxes are imposed. The imposed taxes, we can learn what the real number is, how much is going to appear on your property tax bill in October. And we got a shock this year. It was just about 12% less than Josh told us it would be. The reasons for that are complicated. It's the biggest reason is that real market values on properties are down. There is a cap, a 15% cap on how much an individual property can pay in property taxes. It's 15% of their real market value. So you have your assessed value, which is capped by measures 5 and 50, and that can creep up to 3% a year. In a lot of cases, there's a lot of space between the real market value, usually a higher number, and the assessed value. But when those two numbers get close, mostly with the real market value coming down, you squeeze that 15% cap. So Josh is going to talk with us next month because we expect to have new projections for the coming 2 years, and so we get to chat with him about the situation. It was unfortunate. So the immediate response in our office was to say, okay, we realize we can't fulfill the commitments that we made in terms of grants. So we ran the numbers, and you remember that we ended last year with $4 million. My original projections, we were in conversations, what are we going to do with the extra $2 million? Well, that problem is gone. We have now cut grant levels to where we will end this year, this fiscal year, June 30, with a zero fund balance, close to zero. And so that's how we calculated what cuts were needed, and we came to 4.5% of current grant amounts across the board. That's competitive grants and leverage fund grants. Everybody had to submit, in early December, they had to submit new budgets with 4.5% reductions. And so that will keep the fund from going into a negative balance. It'll keep us solvent, basically. The other,
And that 4.5% equaled.
that comes out to 650,000, yes. And the other way we were able to keep that below 12%, those cuts smaller than might have been, is folks that didn't spend. Remember, I said 94% of grant dollars got spent, budgeted dollars got spent last year. Normally, those folks would be able to carry that money over and say, okay, let's just readjust my budget for this year. We said you cannot do that. Pretty much folks lost about $800,000 in spending that they didn't do last year. So they were not allowed to carry over any of those funds. So that gives us about 1.4, 1.5 million. So that made up the 12% cut. So I already talked about that third bullet there, that the revenues were 12% below. Compression is the name of what happened, and that's about that cap. It squeezes. The unfortunate thing for the children's levy is that we are a local option, and local options get compressed first. So it's us and the Historical Society, and I think currently the libraries. We get squeezed first. Down, the three of us together get squeezed to zero before permanent levy get affected. So it's an unfortunate wrinkle. Our compression percentage went from, I think, 27% last year to 40%. So we really got surprised by a big jump in that number. It's a very difficult number to predict, and we'll talk, as I said, we'll talk to Josh next month about how likely are because we don't want this to happen again. So how can we get really safe numbers in January so we're not surprised again in October? During this, so we also adjusted the administrative budget. We dropped it by 12.6%. So we were able to find savings in our administrative budget. I've been in conversation with Josh, the city economist, about next year. There's unlikely to be a significant increase, as he told me. Of course, assessed values keep going up, so folks that are under the cap on their property taxes are going to see their property taxes rise, and so there'll be an increase to their contribution to the children's levy. But folks that are already capped or close to being capped by compression, by the lower real market values, their contribution to the levy will not go up. So it's property by property. We don't know what's going to happen, but I don't expect it to increase significantly, and this is in conversation with Josh. If next year's revenues are similar to the current year revenues, we will need to cut about $3 million from our current competitive and leverage fund grant commitments, and that's about a 23% cut. So if folks, go ahead.
Just a question, is that per year or over the rest of the levy?
You have your microphone on? Press the green. Yeah.
Is that per year or over the next 2 years of the levy?
It's what I looked at is current year funding levels and then what our likely revenues would be just for next year. So it would be a
$3 million just for next year.
$3 million for next year, yes. Yeah. So likely $3 million per year. So the ballpark numbers are we're currently committed to about, no, we're not currently committed. We're currently committed to only about $700,000, and that's the leverage fund grants that we made commitments and contract for next year. The current competitive grants, which total about $12 million, about $12 million. There's no commitment for next year. We're going to be talking through the spring about renewal of those commitments. But if we were to just say everybody gets renewed at the same amount they're at this year, including the 4.5% reduction that already happened, our total commitments would be $13 million. And so taking $3 million away from that is about a 23% cut. Again, that is very much a provisional number. We're waiting for the city economist. He's promised us new revenue projections for next year, and we'll get a number for the year after. So the final 2 years of the current levy, we'll get those numbers in early January. Any questions?
Okay.
All right.
Well, we wish we had better financial news for all of our grantees, but unfortunately, we do need, as John just said, to anticipate likely spending cuts as we look at renewal of our investments in the spring. We will be discussing this more at our January meeting in terms of possible funding scenarios for this spring. and Levy staff will continue to keep our grantees updated about any potential changes.
It would be nice if we could find out all those houses that were in compression and weren't paying anything to the children's levy, send them a little notice talking about how great we are, and maybe they would contribute what they would have paid had they not been in compression.
There you go.
Now, that's a technique I hadn't thought of.
Just thinking about the fundraising aspects for January's
Yeah,
meeting.
really. Well, moving on, our next item on the agenda, Lisa Pellegrino and Lisa Hansel are going to run through some grantee updates, and we'll be asked for a vote afterward on these proposed program alterations.
Okay, so first up is the only one actually that they'll be that I'm asking for a decision on, because we're going to be looking at restructuring a grant that we currently have, and then Lisa Hansel will give some updates on some things that don't require votes but are just changes.
Is there something in our folder we should be looking at?
There's a memo, and in the memo it kind of gives the details of what the decision is.
Okay, just
So
the
it just
overview
says-
memo that you
Yes,
sent.
exactly.
Okay.
And we're on page 2, grantee updates of the memo. So there's a restructuring proposal for the Big Brothers Big Sisters grants, and I just want to run through what that entails, and also a representative from Big Brothers Big Sisters is here if you have questions and you would like to ask them specifically. We asked them to come today. So the Big Brothers Big Sisters currently has 3 separate grants with us. They have a grant to provide mentoring services that are specifically targeted at foster children. They have a community-based grant, we call it, which is for services that are delivered in their community-based model, which means that's kind of the typical model that most people are familiar with, where you have a mentor from the community, volunteer, who gets clearance to meet with a child in any place and time and can drop them in their car, et cetera. That's the biggest grant. And then we have also a grant to them for school-based mentoring. And for that program, the mentoring can only take place at the school site. It has certain parameters. The person is not cleared to take that child out off of school grounds or be with them in a setting alone. So it's a differently structured program, best way to explain it. Over the past couple of years, the school-based program has been serving fewer kids than they aim to serve. So when we set up a grant, we set up a service target, and we track whether people are able to serve that number of people. And then so we just completed the first 2 years of this levy cycle. And in this first 2 years, the first year they were under, and the second year they were significantly under. So that was causing some concern for staff about whether this model was the right way to go, because they weren't having trouble meeting numbers on the community-based side.
They were under in terms of the number of youth being mentored through the school-based
Yes,
approach.
exactly. So when we announced, as you just heard from John, we had, and as you guys got notice from us, we had to announce the cuts that were as a result of revenues being significantly different than were projected. And Big Brothers Big Sisters came to us to ask whether they might be able to restructure their grants in the face of these cuts to take the full cut for all 3 grants. So when we take 4.5% away from the funding from all 3 grants, we get approximately $20,000 for them. If they could take that full cut in the school-based grant and decrease the number that they were obligated to serve in that grant as a result of that cut, and then, also to decrease the number yet further in that grant that they were going to serve and transfer instead those slots to the community-based grant. So it's 2 different things going on. Just want to make sure that folks are aware of that it's cutting the total number served as a result of the cuts, as well as transferring the type of service the kids are getting for approximately 45 of the kids. So because the school-based program had been not meeting its targets, and I was set to be telling you at renewal that I didn't think I wanted to keep doing that because it was unable to meet the targets, and also because the school-based mentoring is much more difficulty giving a significant amount of mentoring given the constraints of the school day, and also there's continued pressure on the school day with budget cuts and other issues, that it's gotten more and more difficult, I think, for programs to serve during the day because of those constraints. I think it would make sense to move to slots to the community-based model and to cut the total number of slots out of the school-based grant rather than cut them out of the other grants, which are meeting their numbers. So that I was in full agreement with their proposal and would recommend that we go that way. Does anybody have questions of me or also of the Big Brothers person?
I do have a question just of the Big Brothers. I think it's definitely a good proposal. Just curious as to, is the reason because of the different constraints? Is that the main reason, or are there other reasons on top of that they weren't able to meet their target goal?
I'll let them speak to that. I think Patricia's here. Do I have that right? Is Patricia here? Patricia Edge, I thought I saw her walk in. Oh, yeah. I swear I saw you. Okay.
If you could maybe position that microphone so it's closer to you. Just
Sure.
give us your name, and your title, whatever. Okay.
Patricia Edge, VP of Program with Big Brothers Big Sisters.
Okay, and as far as the goal for the school-based program are the constraints that the school was having, is that the main reason that you weren't able to, or are there other additional variables that helped to decrease kind of that number and not be able to
It's
reach
gotten
that goal?
increasingly more difficult for us to provide this kind of service in the school. The schedules are nightmarish for mentoring services in the school because they're always moving around, and our availability to kids is really decreased.
Okay, so that is the only goal, the only reason.
Correct.
Okay.
I have a question, Lisa. In your opinion, since we're going to be looking at further budget cuts next year, I'm concerned that we are purely from a financial perspective, increasing the number of students that are going to be served in the community-based mentoring. If we end up having to make further budget cuts next year, will those slots not be able to be continued, or do you understand what I'm saying? If we're going to, because it's my understanding that this proposal would increase by 44 youth in the community-based mentoring.
Yes, it's essentially transferring the slots. So the service would move to a different program. So, yes, I mean, anybody, we're going to be in that boat with anybody, to be
Right.
honest. So I guess I wouldn't recommend trying to take a cut early, because that just, you're going to have to look at those cuts as a package. Do you see what I'm saying?
Okay.
So yes, it's possible, although I would say that usually they're not forming new relationships that are then cut off as the result of funding cuts. They're using relationships that are already started, that are in the city of Portland and can fulfill for this grant. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it allows them to manage their portfolio within their different funders and requirements. So they're not they never cut off relationships early, at least not to my knowledge, as a result of funding cuts. I mean, that's not generally happened.
Okay, I just want to make sure, because I realize that asking people to take cuts early would not be necessarily appropriate, but we're increasing them in that one area, knowing that we're going to make cuts later. So.
Well, again, I think it's less thinking of, it's not as if they're going out and starting all new matches as a result of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
They're going to report on matches that are existing in Portland, in the city of Portland, to start with, and then they usually can finagle their funding to make that so that matches meet for a year. That's always their goal, is that it's at least a year of service, if not longer. So I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Patricia, but I don't think it's not as if you would be starting something that you would then cut in 6 months.
Right, correct.
So, just to confirm that, these are already, the 44 new slots are already mentorships that you already have. It's just we will assume.
Responsibility for paying for them.
Sorry, I have a cough, so I've been really good about turning it off, and I forget to turn it back on. So the 44 mentorships are already in place, and we're just going to assume the cost of that,
Correct.
right? Okay.
Any further questions on the Big Brothers Big Sister changes? And just to clarify, the community-based mentoring is the typical, what people envision about Big Brothers Big Sisters. That is being paired with a mentor, a young person being paired with a mentor in the community.
Mm-hmm. And they have full range to operate in the community. It's a different level of clearance.
Right. Okay, well, thank you, Patricia.
Great, thank you.
So this we need to vote on, because
Okay.
in order for me to restructure these contracts.
Did you want to run through the other ones? Or was
They don't require a vote particularly. They're just
Okay.
name changes. They're not substantive changes.
So we need so I would entertain a motion to approve the proposed changes to the Big Brothers Big Sisters contracts.
I move we approve.
Second?
Second, okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, you got your approval.
Next is just an update regarding a name change with one of the programs, Casa Start, that's operated through Neighborhood House. It's one of our leverage grant funds in the child abuse prevention area, and they provide services to school-age, elementary and middle school children who reside at New Columbia. And their name has changed from Casa Start to SOUL, which stands for Success, Opportunity, and Leadership. So just an update, if you hear that name in the community, that was previously Casa Start. The second update is in regards to another child abuse prevention contract or grant through children or with Children's Justice Alliance, and they provide services to families who are at risk or involved with the criminal justice system. And they are in the process of merging with Pathfinders of Oregon, and Pathfinders of Oregon also provides programs and supportive services to help criminal justice involved adults and at-risk youth avoid entering or re-entering the criminal justice system. The Children's Alliance and Pathfinders have had a long-standing partnership in providing services to this population. Under our current grant with CJA, Pathfinders is a subcontractor, so they've been providing part of the services that we're supporting under this grant. Effective January 1st of 2012, the CJA will merge with Pathfinders, and Pathfinders will assume the obligations, rights, and responsibilities under the contract or under the agreement. Current staff will continue to be providing the services offered under this grant. And John Kelly has reviewed the financial statements of both of the organizations and has no concerns regarding either organization. There is representation here from Children's Justice Alliance if you have any questions. Just, again, another kind of update, and this will be a pretty seamless transition.
I just have a question. So is the new organization then called Pathfinders, and CJA will not exist in
My
that
understanding is
setting?
CJA will be a program under
Of Pathfinders.
of Pathfinders. Is that correct?
Part of the reason we tell you these things is just so that if you hear about them and somewhere else, you think, did we
What
fund that? I mean, so we want to make sure that you're aware of those kind of mutations over time.
And at the time of renewal, we'll be talking about Pathfinders instead of Children's Justice Alliance. Of course, we can make reference to CJA as well, so you'll hear that as well.
It just gets confusing over
Why
time.
don't you choose one or the other to make it less confusing for us?
Right.
We'll try to use the new name. We try to use
Probably in
people's names.
parentheses, we'll say previously.
Also known as.
Right.
So the last one of these kind of housekeeping updates is we had a grant for many years to the Oregon Health Career Center to provide the AKA science program, which is an after-school science program. This June, we received notice from Oregon Health Career Center that they were ceasing operations and would no longer be able to offer the program, obviously, since they would not be in business at all. In the course of that, I worked with Impact Northwest, which has assumed other after-school programs because they provide a lot of after-school programming as well as SUN programming in the community to see if they might be interested in picking this program up so it could continue to be delivered because it serves quite a lot of kids. They serve about 1,200 kids, duplicated, so multiple classes in the community at Sun School. So it's a significant community resource. Impact was interested, and so they worked over the summer to try to come to agreement and did in fact come to agreement. And so Impact Northwest is assuming and has been gone ahead this fall and offered the AKA Science program at various Sun schools around town. And I'm just in the process of formalizing the paperwork. So the program did go forward as planned this fall, which was good news. But the Oregon Health Career Center no longer exists. So that program has been subsumed into Impact Northwest, which you guys are all familiar with. So that's the last of that kind of update.
Okay.
Any questions on that? Or no?
Great.
Okay.
Well, thank you. And then our next up is a update on the Cradle to Career Initiative, and Lisa Pellegrino will provide us with the latest information on that venture.
So I'm bringing this more to you all, to your attention, because it's a significant community initiative, and Dan is serving on the council, which is sort of the governing board for Cradle to Career, and I serve on the steering committee, which is kind of the next body down that has been working on this initiative. So we're putting some Levy resources into this, and also hopeful that it will be, we also funded it on the collaboration grant side, so it's sort of a two-way thing, and I thought it would be worth kind of letting you know where it's at. I know some of you are kind of keeping up with it, and others maybe less connected to it. So it's just to give people a background on what this is, what the initiative is, and also just to make sense for folks in the audience if they're not particularly keeping track of it. This initiative is modeled on an initiative in Cincinnati called Strive, and the whole concept behind it was to achieve collective impact, to think about how do all our efforts add up to success for children, and how can we measure that, and how can we think about it more as a community rather than just thinking about it on a program-by-program basis. And so they, in Cincinnati, kind of began this work and then began replicating it, or they don't like to call it replication, but began spreading it across the country by helping to start initiatives in other cities. So we are one of those sites that is beginning one of these initiatives. And I sent around, I think, to all of you, and I think I was going to post on the website. I haven't done that yet, but this Stanford Social Innovation article on collective impact, because it does a really excellent job of explaining what the theory is behind doing an initiative like this, and to explain why it's different, where it's not just looking at what's maybe best practices or an excellent program, but trying to understand how do those excellent programs add up together toward a result that we want to achieve for kids, or not. And what can we do to improve that? So that's kind of the focus is on continuous improvement. So this process has gotten started locally, and in fact, this year, I know Dan actually gave a presentation at the national convening here, and I attended the conference that was here for a couple of days. They had all of the initiatives in town that are operating across the country, as well as a heck of a lot of people who are interested in starting them across the country. So it was a few hundred people that were here in Portland for this, and talking about kind of their experience to date, and how to get started and what to do, and it became apparent in going through that process for me, because I was there for the good bit of the conference. The Portland is quite a bit further along than many places in getting it off the ground, because it's not an easy initiative to launch. You have to get a lot of partners on board, and that's not an easy thing to do. I would say we're particularly ahead of the game. I would say we're both ahead and behind. We're ahead of the game on getting a lot of the public folks to come to the table. So a lot of the major stakeholders on the public side, mayors, county chair, city council, all local school districts, in some cases state representation where that's relevant. Those folks are all coming to the table and are represented on the council. And we have pretty good business representation on the council. The area I would say that we're maybe a bit behind compared to other cities is around funders collaboratives. In other cities that are doing these initiatives, there's significant experience with and track record in doing funding collaboratively. So groups of private funders working with public funders together on initiatives, as well as private funders coming together and working in a group to fund a set of things that they want to do. So if they're interested in accomplishing a particular goal, or if they're all funding after-school programs, they come together to think about how might they fund after-school programs in a more organized manner to achieve certain goals, and then to look at those goals to understand whether something happened. So in Cincinnati and in Boston, I had some meetings with the folks in Boston. They've done that, and they've been doing it for years. And so I would say that's something in Portland that we really have not done much of, and there's not a big track record on. And so that's where we need growth, whereas in other places, the biggest struggle is trying to get the public sector to come along with and work with the private folks on the initiative. So there's kind of there's some imbalance, I guess, in terms of progress. So that's some of the stuff that I learned when I was at the conference. The other really interesting thing that I think might be something that is used locally if we can import it successfully. Cincinnati spent a lot of time and gotten a lot of resources from Microsoft and other folks to help them develop an open source product that would allow both school data and community-based program data to exist in the same database. So that if you worked for a school, you might be able to open up this database and see that Charlie is doing very poorly in math and doing very poorly in English, and it also has a Big Brother's mentor and is also participating in the SUM program after school. So you could see all of that in one place on a per-child basis, and both the community person and the school person would have access to that. That requires quite a heavy lift on the FERPA and the confidentiality to make sure all the partners are in order. But they have managed to get that going in Cincinnati, at least on a limited basis, with a select number of partners that are able to do the heavy lifting on the confidentiality side, make sure the paperwork is all done, and then can get access into this database. So that is kind of the holy grail in my world for thinking about how might we look at being able to understand what's happening with a particular child, both in school and out of school. So I think that might be a national model. They definitely did a big presentation down at the conference, and they're looking to be able to make that available, I would say, probably within another year to other places. So that's something that I'm interested in, and other folks in the area are interested in seeing if there's some way we might be able to do that in our current data tracking system. So we have a big school database, but it doesn't include any of the other information, and that's all tracked elsewhere. So those are some of the highlights I'd say that came out of that big conference that was here. And then I thought I'd give you a quick update on just kind of where is the process locally in terms of formation and kind of where will we expect to start seeing the rubber hitting the road. And we're getting closer to that point. I know at least some people have been impatient with the whole process. It's hard to get things set up. So the Portland Schools Foundation, which was formerly named the Portland Schools Foundation, now currently named All Hands Raised, is serving as that backbone organization that's doing all this organization and setting up the boards and committees to get things going. So as I said, Dan is serving on the council. That body has been formed, and they meet about 4 times a year to kind of make the high-level decisions. And that there's a sort of a set of goals that are sort of the main goals over which the report to the community are organized and which the council has ratified as the goals. And those include be prepared for school, be supported inside and outside of school, succeed academically, enroll in some form of post-secondary education, and then graduate and enter a career. So hence the cradle to career concept. The council also kind of ratified 3 sort of priorities meant to organize the on-the-ground work toward achieving the goals. And those were eliminating disparities in youth success, ensuring that all students enter school prepared to learn, and then linking community and family supports to children and youth success. So around those priority areas and goals, those are kind of the superstructure. The steering committee is going to be looking, I believe this week, looking at proposals from the community from mostly collaborations of people acting as conveners. So the idea being that there will be a group or a couple of organizations who will take responsibility for convening groups around these goal areas, these goals and strategic priorities, to try to get them to do this process. If you look at that Stanford Innovation Review, so they're looking at trying to identify a common agenda amongst them, share measurement, have continuous communication and mutually reinforcing activities amongst all participants, and then measuring their progress. So those collaboratives, those groups that will be convened, are all aiming to achieve those, or to take themselves through those steps and achieve those goals. So I think there's 5 different proposals, which I need to read, from lead conveners to begin this work, and the steering committee will make some recommendations to the council about how many collaboratives to begin. And I think that All Hands Raised is looking at doing somewhere between 2 and 4. I think they're a little concerned about how much they can bite off in 1 year in terms of supporting collaboratives. And as you noted, Deborah, they're not actually providing funding, but they are providing facilitation support and what they call 6 Sigma support, which is continuous improvement support. So a consultant essentially that helps you figure out how you're going to continually improve what you're doing. So that's the next step will be to kind of get those collaboratives up and running. And I expect in another 6 months I should have some more information for you all about kind of what's been the progress on that and what are they working on, because they do, this is sort of a request for qualification. So the lead conveners are going to convene, and then the group has to get together and decide, well, what is our common agenda? What do we want to achieve, and how are we going to measure it? So they have parameters around that, but they don't have those specifics decided yet. So that's the next step. And I would, like I said, expect in about 6 months to have some more information about what's happened on the ground at that point. Anybody have questions?
Yeah, do you know how they're doing on the fundraising? I know they had a fairly ambitious goal set, and how that's playing out.
I wouldn't say they're not doing sort of regular reporting to us. They're going to do an annual report. So we haven't hit that annual period yet. But I can find out for you if you're interested. I can find out what their progress is. I'd be happy to do that.
I think I opened an email today from Khalil Ladd that had some. I didn't read the report, but I thought it said there was a new report out. So that might be the annual report.
Could be. I haven't gotten that email, or I haven't opened it. That fundraising progress is kind of a different question because that's usually a bit more specific. But I could find that out for you. Okay, thanks. Get back to you.
Any other questions on Cradle to Career? Okay, thanks. And then next on our agenda is the annual Portland Children's Levy data presentation. There is a lot of data, so the staff has decided to break up the data into 2 parts and to present demographic and performance issues today and save the remainder for our next meeting, which is in January.
Yes.
Okay. And Meg and Lisa.
Yeah, we're going to... Let me just grab my notes.
And a PowerPoint, right?
We do.
Okay, great.
Yeah, it's on the screen.
Well, first off, I want to thank Meg McElroy, who's manning the machine over there, for doing the lion's share of the heavy lifting on this section of the report. She is the person who aggregates. We get data from 70-plus different organizations, and Meg is the person who does the spreadsheet craziness that makes me cross-eyed, and does a great job of it. So to thank her, first off, for putting all this together, or a significant portion of it together. And I wanted to sort of remind folks why we do this presentation, so hopefully you won't be drowning in the data for no thought for what is the reason I need to look at all this. So the first reason is to make sure that we set certain goals, so people have, as I just discussed with the contract that came up today, there's performance and targets around services and around populations that we're trying to serve, and we try to make sure that we're keeping track of that and then report back to you just as an accountability function. Are we meeting the goals that we set, and if not, why? The other thing is, grantees spend a lot of time gathering this information. It takes a lot of effort to do it, and I want to highlight that as well. I think it's when we come here and we give you all this information and you hear it in half an hour or 40 minutes, it really minimizes the amount of time it takes for them to gather all of this information and put it into usable format for us. So it's an enormous effort for folks, and they've spent a lot of time on it, and they do it because we want to make sure we are serving who we say we're going to serve. Pardon me. And if not, we figure out why. So I think that's the main reason. It highlights their accountability to us and to you all as a body. And then last, we're always looking to improve program delivery and administration. This is one of the ways that we assess it. If we're not meeting goals, how do we figure out how to do it better? Or how do we figure out how to gather data better? How do we make it less onerous? We're always trying to look at that so that we don't overburden people and that we use the information that we're gathering. So those are kind of the main reasons. As Dan said, today we are going to hopefully not drown you. Last year we had to cut out half the presentation because it was too long, so we thought this time we won't do that. We'll just split it into two and hopefully not drown you in too much information. Today we're looking at primarily demographics and also looking at some other policy goals that the levy had and trying to assess how well we're doing on those policy goals. The next time we'll be looking at the participation data, so that's a very key data that we just started collecting in this levy cycle. We'll have some more interesting information about that this year, as well as looking at outcome goals and what folks achieved, and then staff turnover in the organizations that we fund. Those will be the topics for January. Okay, you want to get to first? Oh, you're right there. Thank you. Trying to pay attention to what we're doing here. Meg and I are going to try to be a team and making sure I keep the slides up with what we're talking about. So on numbers of children served, good news on that on the whole. Our goal, so in the goal, that number is comprised of each, contract has a goal for how many folks it's going to serve. And so we add up all that together. The goal was a little over 15,000 and the actual was a little over 17,000. So we exceeded the goal. And by a significant amount, and that's all good news. That's due in part to leverage fund grants, adding those in, and also in part to the fact that certain programs served more kids than they anticipated. And although that always sounds like good news, I want to remind you that that's not always good news, in the sense that if people are participating for short periods of time but turning over in a program frequently, that might send those numbers up, and you might be inclined to think, okay, that's great, they served double the amount of kids that they said they were going to serve. But if actually they got only half the amount of service that you intended, that's less than good news. So it's good to always take that, with a grain of salt, and then that's one of the reasons why we track participation data, which we'll be talking to you about next time, to understand. We want to make sure that folks are coming to the program, and it's nice if they can serve more than they anticipated, so that's great, but that they also come and stay for long enough to hopefully get the benefit of the program. So it's a two-pronged goal, I would say. So I would say the other is in terms of funding or serving more kids, and when we started to look into some of the reasons as to why that was the case, why don't we turn to the program area slide? It's probably best spoken about, broken up by program area. You can see that we were over in different amounts. So in after school, we served significantly more than the goal. Mentoring, we served a little less, and others, kind of somewhere in the middle. Actually, I guess child abuse was the highest. So there were some specific reasons why certain areas were over to the degree they were over. And in after school, I would say SUN programs were the primary driver of that. There's huge demand for services and SUN programs, and although we tend to follow the county's guidelines for how many folks that must be served in a year, so we kind of try to align our contracting with the county's contracting. By and large, programs that we funded serve quite a bit more than that, and that's partly because kids have the opportunity to come in and take one class if they want in many of these programs, particularly at the older ages. So we fund one high school, and we also fund a couple of middle schools. So at the elementary level, you see kids who come and stay for longer periods of time. At the upper levels, you'll see kids who come and take a class and then cycle through, which increases the numbers total that are served, but the amount of service might be less than in some cases. So Sun was a significant driver of that. And then the other primary driver, I would say, after school was additional partnerships. A lot of times, you can't necessarily forecast this. So an organization doesn't come to us and say, I forecast that I'll have partnerships with these 5 people, these other 5 organizations, and that will increase my numbers by 20%. They can't forecast that, but it happens. And so when that happens, when we fund a program, we're often a piece of funding. They might have 5 different funding sources for that program, and they're reporting to us on all the kids that they serve. But if they make an additional partnership, that might increase the total funding for the program and increase the number of kids that are served above what they originally thought. So that's the other driver in after school, I would say, is that we've got people who make partnerships on the ground. Other money becomes available. School districts have money to fund a summer program so they can increase the total number of kids that are served. So that's a part of the driver. Go ahead.
So these numbers aren't necessarily the numbers of children served due to our funding. They might be in their program, but because they receive funding from other sources?
Well, you got to remember that our funding is often a piece of funding for most programs that we fund. That's just the way the people fund stuff. I mean, it isn't smart really to rely only on one funding source for a program, because if that funding source goes away, the program dies. So typically, organizations blend funding together for let's take an after-school program, for instance. So they may have several different sources. The school district might be putting in money for a portion of it. They might have a partner organization who wants to come in and offer that service, which is essentially money to them, because it means they don't have to deliver that part.
Right, I got that. But also sometimes you say, with your money, we are going to be able to serve 40 kids. With other funds, we will serve additional children with additional funds. So I just want to clarify that with our money, when they're not sitting with money from Children's Levy, they serve 40 kids, but potentially they serve 60 kids because they got an additional funding source. And
yes, and
okay.
that accounts for the increase.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
In some cases, and particularly in after school, that was the case. So when I went through all of my group of programs and I looked at who was significantly over, those were the primary reasons. Some programs serving many more children than what they had been technically obligated to serve. Again, because we follow the county model on what the minimum service should be. And people forming partnerships, getting additional funding that amps up, particularly around summer programming. That's where I saw the biggest change. And so because it's constructed as a pool, you have to remember we have to ask people to report on a pool of kids. Because it's a pooled approach, if the pool gets bigger, they serve more kids. So those were the primary reasons in after school. In mentoring, which was slightly under the service goal, that was due primarily to 2 programs that significantly underserved compared to what their goal was. And the bulk of the programs, 6 met or exceeded their goals, and 2 were only slightly under. So the main reason for that was 2 specific programs, one of which you heard about today, which we're going to be addressing, and the other one we'll talk about at renewal time. And then I think for child abuse and foster care, Lisa will tell you why those numbers were different than what was originally.
With the child abuse, it appears that it's quite high. And on reviewing those programs, what I found was that several of the programs actually set their goals around families to be served versus children to be served. There were actually 5 programs that fell into that category. So when you consider that most of the families served have more than one child, many average 2 to 3 children per family, you quickly exceed a goal number. So we weren't comparing apples to apples. So when making those adjustments for goals, it actually would be 6.8% served more than projected, which is not an alarming percentage or cause for concern. So that's really what explains the child abuse figures there. For foster care, I believe that the number that's served over the 11.3%, that has to do with, it was the second year of operation, so we didn't see the same number of overage in the first year because many of the programs were in the startup phase. Additionally, I think it's important to point out the foster care area is the area that we serve the fewest number of children as a funding area, 567, so 11.3% is 64 children. So again, that's not a huge actual number of children. And so I don't necessarily believe that the 11.3% is indicative of high turnover or other problems within the funding area.
So it's indicative of serving more children in foster care.
More children, right, correct. And again, the programs in that funding area are still relatively new programs, and so some of the programs may have set lower goals than what they actually were able to serve. Some could have had additional resources, some could just serve more children than they initially thought they'd be able to.
Well, and if they're serving 500 plus kids, 11% is 6 kids or whatever. So it's not, what you're saying is, it may look like a huge number, but it's...
Right, but it's not a huge number. It's a very small number in terms of the actual numbers. If you were to say 11.3% of the children after school, that would be a much larger number.
Kids, yeah.
But we're talking less, 50 or 64 children. So it's very small. Okay. Other questions on that?
So I'm going to walk you through the next couple of slides. We're going to talk to you about the race and ethnicity of children served. And we're presenting this information for a couple of reasons. We want to look at it through an equity lens, first to understand how well are our services reaching the children as a portion of the population or as a portion of the local school enrollments. And then more importantly, how well are we reaching populations that are disproportionately affected by the achievement gap and entrance into foster care. And so because we don't collect outcome-specific data disaggregated by race and ethnicity, looking at these population numbers are sort of our proxy for understanding how well we're doing reaching those populations that are disproportionately affected by those negative outcomes. So in this slide, this is just sort of a macro-level view of the total children served by the Levy last year and how grantees reported that they were how they identified by race and ethnicity. Over 65% of the children served are children of color, and this trend has been fairly consistent in all of the years that we have aggregated and presented this information. Similarly, a trend that's been relatively consistent is that Latino children have made up roughly the largest portion of children of color that we serve. Of total children served by the Levy, they are 27%, and African American children are the second largest group of children of color, and they make up 19.6% of the children served by the Levy. And as I said, these trends have been relatively consistent, or these portions have been relatively consistent over the past 5 years that we have collected and aggregated this information. Latinos have composed 20 to 27% of children served, and African American children have been 20 to 26% of children served. And I should add that our category, African American, is somewhat of a crude measurement because it includes also African immigrant children, so African American / African children. So this is to give you sort of a sense of how well the Levy did serving children of color as compared to their portion of enrollment in the school district and the local population. And in general, it appears that the Levy is doing a very good job serving children of color, particularly populations that are at risk with regard to the achievement gap and disproportionately overrepresented in our foster care system. I'm going to walk you kind of through this slide and what it tells us, and we're going to look at children of color at the large level and then sort of break it down by subgroups. So under the first row, children of color, you can see they composed a little over 65% of children served by the Levy. And in this same year, 2010, 2011, they composed about 47% of school district enrollment in Portland. So we looked at the school districts that are mainly located in the city of Portland, not all of Multnomah County school districts. And we didn't try to, because we don't have access to this data from the Department of Education, we didn't look at each school only that we serve in the Levy. So that number is really a district level number, and some of the schools in those districts we don't necessarily serve. But this was our best way to sort of get a proxy for how well is the Levy doing serving children of color compared to their population in the school districts that are mainly in Portland. So as you can see, the Levy does exceed that portion. And then in the final column there, we're looking at how well is the Levy doing compared to what portion of the population children of color make up in Multnomah County. Those Multnomah County data are based on American Community Survey data from about 2005 to 2009 that are available online. The 2010 census at the county level is not yet available, at least not that I could find. And then a couple important points to note about those Multnomah County numbers. One is that we're talking about people of all ages in the county, so we don't have the numbers sort of separated out for children of color. And if we did, we would probably find that the percentage of children in color is higher than the percentage of all people of color in the county, because children are a greater number of the population of color in our community. So while the levy is doing better than sort of serving children of color compared to their portion of the population in Multnomah County, if we were looking at children of color specifically in those data, those numbers would probably be higher. So I don't know that our performance would look as good as it does on this slide, so to speak. Another really important point to note about school district enrollment data and the county population data is something I want to point out that was reported in the Communities of Color of Multnomah County report, An Unsettling Profile, which is that historically getting an accurate count of children of color or people of color in a given community is difficult demographically for a number of reasons. Folks tend to opt out of sort of census procedures for fear of the system or profiling. Sometimes it's difficult to find people because of poverty, housing mobility, language issues. There have been changes in data collection forms over time. So all of those sort of errors in data collection also may underestimate really what the local population of color looks like, both in terms of the enrollment data and in the population data. So on the face of it, Levy appears to be doing a good job reaching populations most at risk for the achievement gap and entrance into the foster care system. But with some flawed data, we can't say conclusively that we are. So I walked you sort of through that first line about children of color, and in terms of how well we're doing reaching Latino children as a portion of school enrollments and county population, and African American children as a portion of school enrollments and county population. Again, we appear to be doing a good job, and if we had more accurate data, we could say more conclusively how good of a job that we're doing. But as it stands now, it looks relatively good.
Well, given undercounting, it's good that the numbers are padded as much as they are. Does that make sense? In the sense that not padded, but I mean, that we're significantly above. So if the school enrollment numbers are actually low, in terms of representing the percentage of the school enrollment that is a particular group, it's good that we're above. We're serving. So hopefully we're closer to what the real count is, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Or exceeding it compared to their risk. Okay, so on the next slide, again, just kind of walking through sort of some of the subgroups of population and the children that we served. You can see that with Asian Pacific Islander children, the levy is slightly it appears to be underserving them as compared to their portion of the school enrollment and population. This is probably mainly because we didn't fund any programs that are culturally specific, serving only that population. We do serve that population with programs funded in organizations that serve other populations of color, but not solely that population in and of itself. So I think our numbers could be down a little bit there. Another sort of really important point on this slide is that the row talking about multiracial, multi-ethnic children, we serve a very large portion of children who, through grantee demographic reports, identify as multiracial, multi-ethnic. And we don't know sort of what that breakdown is. So those children, if we had more ways to kind of disaggregate them and break them apart, may make some of our other numbers go up too. And that could be particularly true with the Native American, Alaska Native children, because according to a report that was put out by that community a couple of years ago called Making the Invisible Visible, Native American children and Native American Alaska Native folks in Portland are more likely, twice as likely to be identifying as multiracial, multi-ethnic as they are just Alaska Native American alone. So if we were able to disaggregate our multi-ethnic, multiracial data, we might see that our Native American, Alaska Native children portion served count goes up a little bit. Another really important point to note about the Native American Alaska Native population is that when it comes to the undercounting issue that I mentioned earlier, that population also locally recently put out a report through the communities of color that helps highlight that issue a little bit more. That population is particularly undercounted or seems to have sort of more substantial issues with the undercounting in the past for a number of reasons. Not only the poverty and mobility and for the systems issues I talked about, but there's also sort of, I think the fear of the system issues may be more exacerbated there when you think about the historical context of things like boarding schools and just sort of how the U.S. has treated Native folks in this country over time. So we have the undercounting issues there that are sort of more pronounced. And locally, there was an effort by the Native population, headed up by NAIA, to look at a community-validated way of better understanding what portion of the population Native American, Alaska Native folks make of in our community. And they looked at birth rates and death rate trends over the past decade. They called over 300 different tribes to get at tribal registries and understanding better what the tribal membership looks like in the metro area. And then they also did an estimate for folks who aren't enrolled in tribes, because there are a fair number of Native American Alaska Natives who don't necessarily enroll in tribes. And essentially what they arrived at was that population could be as high as, that portion could be as high as 5% of our population. If that were true, then we are underserving that group. So again, in this slide, it's kind of hard to know more conclusively how well we're doing serving these particular communities, though we could be doing a good job, which probably likely we could be doing a slightly better job. So next we're going to talk about how well we're doing in particular program areas. Given the, I'm going to talk about early childhood, and then Lisa Pellegrino is going to talk about the mentoring program area on this slide. Given the achievement gap and concerns about school readiness for Native American, Alaska Native, and African American African children, it is likely that the levy could be doing a much better job serving these particular groups. We are serving them essentially as they make up a portion of school district enrollments, which, we're serving their portion of the population. But considering their risk for those two issues I just discussed, school readiness, entering school not ready to learn, and the achievement gap, we should probably be doing a much better job. This trend was true. This sort of issue was true last year. We haven't changed any programs that we were funding from last year to this year, so it's not surprising that these numbers haven't changed. But we're letting you know this because as we go forward, it's probably worth considering whether or not we want to focus our investments in this area because of the risk factors in these populations and knowing what we know about how important early childhood is to reducing the achievement gap.
And just also that the leverage fund grants didn't specifically affect, that was the other reason to bring this data back to you this year, is because even though we made leverage fund grants, it didn't really affect those numbers significantly. So we didn't, and that's partly, I think, we're not getting proposals for these populations in early childhood, to be honest. I think that's a lot of the issue, but I think that begs the question of, do we need to do more to foster that program in the community? If you understand what Meg just said about, what everybody's aware of around early childhood being so key to not creating the achievement gap, and then that we don't ever really solve. So I think that's going to be something we need to really seriously consider in the next round of funding if the levy is renewed. On mentoring, you can see that we're sort of under the population for Native American, or sort of under the formal count. And again, if we went with the community validated count of somewhere near 5%, we're very significantly under that in mentoring. And as I said last year, I don't think this reason has really changed. I think we don't see that this population utilizes formalized mentoring programs that are serving mainstream folks as well as they might access other type of programming. And second, we are not funding any culturally specific programs that are really aimed at mentoring. And there's some concern, I think, that those types of programs are not culturally appropriate because of it's not that mentoring doesn't occur. It does. I think that many folks at NAIA, for instance, we fund programming at NAIA, would say that they are mentoring kids, but it's not classed as a mentoring program in the formalized way that we fund it. So I think part of it is a classification issue. And then part of it is potentially an issue of, again, are we getting applications? If it's not an appropriate intervention that the community wants, it may not be something that is really, that we need to increase necessarily, if that makes sense, if it's not an appropriate intervention, structured like that. And I think SCI would say the same thing. They do mentoring, but they're not a mentoring program in kind of the way that it's classified in the literature or in the research, if you want to look at it that way. So there's mentoring can take place in many contexts. So I'm not sure I don't mean to say that there's no mentoring going on. I just mean to say there's not formal programming funded as such. So that's, I think, the reason why we're kind of under in that area. And that won't change probably unless we change how we describe what a mentoring program is going to do or needs to do, or communities come together to structure programs, that are in ways that they're more likely to be classified as a mentoring program as opposed to something else. I think that's it.
In the next slide, we're looking at the percentage of specific populations within foster care programming served through Levy programs and also child abuse programs as compared to the percentage of those same populations in foster care. So first I just want to say within the foster care program area, the data hasn't significantly changed from the previous year. Again, for the same kinds of reasons that Meg mentioned, we're funding the same program, so we wouldn't expect to see a huge change there. The Levy is doing a good job in terms of directing funding and services for the Native American and African American populations that are overrepresented in the foster care system. One of the things that I would like to point out, and the reason the Latino Hispanic population is highlighted there, is that it appears that we're underserving the population in foster care programs as compared to the number or the percentage of children in the foster care system for that population. And that may be something that we want to consider highlighting and focusing on the next time we award funding in the foster care area. And also of note, between last year, the number or the percentage of Latino and Hispanic children in foster care actually grew from about 11% to the 13.6% in just 1 year's time. So I think it's important that we continue to monitor that and respond accordingly the next time investments are made.
Lisa, just so we fully understand this
Sure.
figure, could you just walk us through the first row here and African Americans? So
Sure. So the first...
there's 25% of children in foster care in Multnomah County are African American.
Correct.
Okay, and the first column, 27.7%
means that the Levy program of the children served in foster care programs, 27.7% were African American, as compared to the 25% figure that were served in Multnomah County.
Okay, and then the next column.
So in the next column is
18.7. Yeah.
Right. So in the child abuse funding area, 18.7% of the children served were African American.
Okay.
And the same reference across.
Thanks.
So in the foster, like I said, in the foster care area, it looks like our culturally specific programming that was awarded helped us to serve the populations of African American and Native American. And I would specifically point out that we have one contract to serve the Native American community, and 82% of the Native Americans that we served through the Levy programming was because of that one contract. So, and for African American, there was one culturally specific program that was granted, and that was about 25 to 30% of the African American children served through Levy foster care programs were due to that contract. So to highlight the importance of culturally specific contracting. Moving to the child abuse area, you can see that we're not doing as good of a job in terms of focusing services for both the African American and Native American populations in child abuse prevention programming, and we didn't have a focus like we did in foster care on funding those specific programs. So that's something that I think is also important for us to consider the next time that we go out requesting funding, that we do highlight those areas and help prevent children from entering foster care.
You got moved on. Okay. So next slide is around after school and the distribution again of service amongst various populations in this funding area. And I would say this funding area, of all the funding areas we analyzed, this kind of came the closest to matching or exceeding the populations in terms of their school district enrollments. Again, keeping in mind, particularly with the Native population, that we might be looking at something that's closer to 5% rather than 1.2%, in which case we're doing half as well as we think we should be doing. So I think one of the reasons why this area is perhaps a little bit better distributed and more in line with the populations as they are a percentage in the school district enrollments is that we serve more kids in this program area than in any other program area. So you have a much larger population over which to distribute your services, and you tend to get a more normal distribution, for one. Yeah, that's really the main point. I'm thinking, okay, I have nothing else to say about that. The key thing to keep in mind is again, we definitely want to be, given the achievement gap, we want to see our numbers, so the percentage of the populations that we're serving is higher than what's represented, because we need to reach those kids. It's more important that we reach those kids.
My turn again.
I was going to say it's your turn.
This slide shows the percentage of by percentage, the primary language spoken in the homes of the children served: English, Spanish, other, or not given. 32% of children served do not speak English as a first language. Across all the program areas, over 1,800 children speak a first language other than English or Spanish. Programs reported at least 59 languages as the primary languages spoken in the home, as compared to 25 last year. Wow. A key point in this slide is that the levy is reaching a significant percentage of children who do not speak English as a first language, which is a significant risk factor for poor educational outcomes. The number and the proportion of children served by the levy who speak a primary language other than English or Spanish has grown substantially over the past 5 years, from 7% in fiscal year 06-07 up to 11% this past fiscal year. And you can see the graph shows that as well. This next one's mine as well. This slide looks at the ages of children served in the levy. As has been true for the past 5 years, the age group of 0 to 5 has been where a good majority of the services are provided. While this age group represents about a quarter of the span of ages, approximately 41% of the children fall into this age group. So we're really doing a good job serving young children. One area to point out of concern, though, is in the foster care, we're not serving quite as many children in this age group. There was a slight improvement from last year. However, the foster care population is about 36.7% of the children are in this age group, and levy programs in foster care served about 30% of the children ages 0 to 5. So we're underserving that age group in the foster care program area. As a whole, about 41% of the children served by the levy are 0 to 5. Also, within the foster care area, again, the total numbers are fairly small, but with the Native American population, about 30% of the children in foster care are 30% of the Native American children who are in foster care in Multnomah County are ages 0 to 5. The levy programs served about 14.7% of the Native American children served within our foster care programming were Native American 0 to 5. So we're underserving that population within our foster care programming. That makes sense.
Which is something, given the risk level, I think that's of concern. I mean, I think trying to make sure, I think we need to think next time around about trying to do a better job with very young children in foster care, because that's where so much of the damage gets done. So I just think that's something that we need to keep an eye on and think about next time around.
And then young children in general in foster care, and then specifically young Native American children in foster care as well.
All right. I'll walk you through this next slide. The key takeaway from here is that we are doing a good job reaching some of our most vulnerable children based on socioeconomic status. So in this graph, I should back up. We collect data from programs on socioeconomic status of children served a couple of different ways. We collect it directly from programs, and they get it from the children and families, and then we get some data directly from the school district, but they can only tell us free and reduced lunch rates. So we have to kind of meld those things together, and this graph represents that. So as you can see, the darkest orange piece of pie indicates that 24% of the children served by the levy are living at or below the federal poverty level. And just as a reminder, that's an annual income of $22,000 for a family of 4. 19% of the children served by the children's levy are with families where incomes are between 101 to 130% of the federal poverty level, or they qualify for free lunch, which is at or below the poverty level. So when you add the 19% and the 24% together, you get 43% of the kids served by the children's levy are living somewhere below 130% of the federal poverty level, and are probably a lot closer to being at poverty level. And again, even 130% of the federal poverty level is $29,000 a year for a family of 4. And that's half of the median income of Portland. Median income in Portland is $71,000 for a family of 4. The yellow piece of pie indicates that 10% of the children served by the levy are between 131 to 185% of the federal poverty level. That's the reduced lunch portion. And then as you can see in the blue section of the pie, 45% of children served we have no data for. And that portion has been pretty consistent over the last 5 years. It's been hard to get these data. But generally speaking, we've been serving well over 50% of the children we've served over the past 5 years have been children who fall into the yellow or orange or very dark orange pieces of the pie, and indicates to us that we're doing a fairly good job reaching Portland's most vulnerable children.
Okay, we're coming to the home stretch. The last 2 slides. We appreciate your patience and attention through all the data. So the last 2 slides we're bringing to your attention to, again, kind of keep your eyes on some overall policy goals that when we started out with the last, with the RFI, with the fund, essentially the funding application, we gave extra points to programs who were going to serve either going to school east of 82nd Avenue or residing there, to try to address the issue that we all know is the case, that poverty is moving east and there is a lack of programming in the east side of the town. So we decided we were going to put a finer point on how we track this. We used to only track it by northeast, southeast, that kind of data, but starting with this levy period, we began to track by zip code, which gives us a much finer point on how we're serving. So for the past couple of years, the data has shown us pretty much has not really moved much. About 39% of the children served were resided or went to school east of 82nd Avenue, and about 56% of the children served went to school in zip codes that border 82nd Avenue. So again, zip codes are not a perfect system because they don't all stop and end at 82nd Avenue. They overlap that, and some abut, but then go further west significantly. So, you have to kind of look at both numbers, how many are actually east and how many are close by, to understand. And what we saw was that even with leveraged fund investments, which included those same extra points for doing that, we did not move those numbers. So they stayed. We made when I reported this data to you last year, we had not made leveraged fund investments yet. So the numbers were 39 and 56, and they stayed that way. So it just goes to show that, extra points is maybe helpful, but maybe not enough to try to move in. There's many factors in how you make investments, but if you are serious about beginning to push it further east, it may take a more deliberate effort than just doing extra points. So something to think about.
We
for the
know
future.
that there were more it also could show that we had already funded most of the programs that were serving kids in East Portland. So do we know that there were programs that we did not fund in the leverage that we could have? Because it seemed like, if I remember correctly, we did maybe give extra points, but I think we also were cognizant of making that as a decision factor.
I mean, there were many, yes, but I think there were many factors. All I'm saying is that I think that in making leverage investments, there are many factors, and it doesn't appear that rose enough to the top to make the difference. I didn't go back and analyze how many programs applied that would have served east of 82nd that did or didn't get funded, which would be relevant, but I did not do that. So I can put that on my list. So the same or somewhat different results for culture specific. You recall we also gave extra points for culture specific programming in an effort to try to increase that amount of programming in the community. Since we heard pretty consistently in community feedback before the last levy that these programs were important, I think you've seen some of the data. I think you can see how important they are in terms of reaching those populations. So in foster care and Native American, that's 80% of the kids we're serving is through a culture specific program. In foster care for African Americans, it was 25% of the kids that we're serving is through a culture specific contract. So they can really have a significant effect on the total amount of that population you're able to reach. So I think that's something to keep in mind. We did a little better in terms of numbers served this year. So if you look at the comparison data in that middle column there, we served about 12.5% last year through culture-specific program. This year it went up to almost 16%. And again, that is due in part to leverage fund programming as well as culture-specific programs for after school, and they both served significant numbers of youth in this past year. And again, if you remember back to the after school slides, we served many more than were anticipated, so that beefed up numbers considerably. In terms of the percentage of the annual investment, not really changed, which is not surprising. That it takes a lot because the leverage for investments were only $2.5 million over the overall pie was quite a bit larger. Even though we invested some in culturally specific program, it wasn't enough to move a percentage points. But we did move it in terms of the number of kids served, so that's good news. But again, in terms of keeping our eye on that prize as we go forward, we may need to think about other ways to foster that kind of programming growing in our community, and maybe we need to do other things on the front end to improve our reach in culture-specific programming. So again, we're bringing these data to you mostly to remind you to keep these points in mind as we begin. If we are lucky enough to renew the levy, we'll have to construct a funding application again and to think about those things on the front end, given the data that we're able to look at year to year. So that concludes part one. Unless you've got more questions, which we'd be happy to answer.
Thank you very much. We're glad you broke it into two parts.
Yes. We thought we might lose you all otherwise.
Any questions?
Unfortunately, we're going to lose Alyssa.
Do any members of the allocation committee have any questions on the data?
I'm just curious because my organization works so much with small grassroots nonprofits that you have people who are so impassioned about what they're doing and they can deliver the service. They can't necessarily write grants. And, I know grant writing is one of those key areas that if you can't really share your story, you're not going to get a high score. So do you see on the front end, especially working with small nonprofits in communities of color, that there's something we can do to help them through that process? And it's not just taking them through a grant writing class because, again, they may not have the technical skill on that staff to help them through that process. But I'm just thinking, one issue might be of the lack of, nonprofits even doing the application process because it's very intimidating. Yep. And so what can be done on the front end to help those organizations that are serving many communities of color, especially immigrant, refugee, that may even have those language barriers themselves as a nonprofit? Maybe that's not something to answer right now, but it's something I think that we should consider. And hopefully the levy is renewed and that we go forward with being able to have these things considered. So that was just something I just kind of wanted to bring forth.
And we've thought about it as well, about what kind of technical support could we reasonably offer. I mean, that's where our administrative runs into difficulties because we are not, grant consultants. And so the question is, what could we do, or could we hire somebody to do it, or what would it cost, and how much could you make available? There's a lot of issues there, but I think it's definitely something that we need to think about because I think that does handicap some people without a doubt. The other side of that coin to keep in mind is that we have significant data collecting requirements, and that is a barrier for small organizations, period, be they culture specific or otherwise. And so that's something to think. You also don't want to court people who don't have systems in place. In other words, if you don't have supports to offer them all the way through, that can be an issue. So you could support them on the front end to make an application, and they might be successful, but they may also need supports on the back end to be able to collect the data that you need collected in order to present this type of information, and as well as the other information that we ask people to gather, particularly around outcome, which is not easy for organizations. That takes a lot of time and energy. So I would say that there's no doubt that there's handicaps for small organizations because of the data requirements that we have and accountability that we have, and you have to have audits. That's the other big sticking point is audits. So there's things there you may want to reevaluate those things, but I think they have to be considered more as a package, I guess is what I would say, rather than only considering on the front end what people can do.
I agree with that, but I'm just thinking if we want to move those numbers, when you look at the communities of colors that are being served, you're not going to find there's only a couple in our community, and therefore, one end does impact the other. And so just
without a doubt.
And I completely agree. I wouldn't want to set anyone up for failure, but to be able to say that's what we're doing on the front end, and then finding what are those supports that are needed, even if they came together as some kind of collaboration, what have you, but just the fact that we are looking at the whole package and understanding that in order for us to move those numbers, that does have to be addressed.
I totally agree.
Other question? Well, great. That brings us to our last item on the agenda, which is bidding a fond farewell, and with many thanks to our friend and colleague, Alyssa Kinney-Geyer. For those of you who don't know, Alyssa Kinney-Geyer is now State Representative Alyssa Kinney-Geyer. She was appointed to fill the vacancy left by Ben Cannon in the state legislature. She's been a member of our allocation committee since 2007, and during her tenure has contributed an amazing amount of energy, expertise, and dedication to this role, many times very late in the night. So she spends a lot of her hours when most of us are sleeping analyzing our grants and our applications and sending out emails to us. So her commitment to at-risk children and families and culturally specific communities and making sure all youth in Portland have the opportunity for health and success, it has been much appreciated by all of us on this committee and everyone we serve. So we wish her the best of luck as she heads to Salem, and we're confident she will find great success there and be a voice for children. Alyssa's replacement on the allocation committee has big shoes to fill. And as we go about the process of securing the next City of Portland citizen representative, I just wanted to remind people who are watching or in the audience that submitting an application to be considered to be the Portland City representative must be submitted by this Friday, December 16th. And those interested in information on particular can go again to the Portland childrenslevy.org website to get more information. And then we have a small token of our appreciation, and I'm sure my rest of my colleagues may want to say a few remarks too, but a small token of our appreciation for your years of service.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Oh my gosh.
Calligraphy. Right?
Wow, that was your calligraphy late at night too.
Maybe
Can I say something?
you could say something first.
Great. Okay.
Yes.
First of all, I really want to thank you, Commissioner Saltzman, for your original vision in setting this up. Portland is one of the few cities in the country that really is looking at research that shows that we need to invest in kids if we're going to have a healthy society. And I think you have just had an incredible vision that you put out there, that you rallied support around, and that you've overseen this process for many years now, since 2003, that has produced incredible results, which is why it's so supported in the community. So I want to thank you, first and foremost, and the rest of my allocation committee members here. And then also, of course, the staff, Lisa, and Meg, and Mary Gay, and John. You've done an incredible job. And I look at, the stability that we have, and that's because it's such a well-run organization. It's really, we've had disagreements among allocation committee members and among, staff and allocation members, but I wouldn't ever call it conflict. It's been, really great discussions about some really tough issues with nuances. So I really appreciated that. I did want to leave with a few, because I started out on this side advocating for certain things when the allocation committee first started meeting, and now I'm on this side, and now I'm going to be back at that side, so you won't not see me ever again. But I did want to just say a few things about what the directions that we've gone in that I really want to affirm and encourage you to continue going in. You're going to have some really hard decisions coming up with a huge amount of cutbacks. And I encourage you not to take an approach of across-the-board cuts. I know we had to do that in this last round, and that's really hard for the grantees out there that had the 4.5% cut and could not carry over whatever funds they hadn't used from last year. There was no ability between now and June to make a different kind of decision. But I think going forward, I think it's really important to look at a lot of the data that you've so rigorously collected and affirm some of the directions we've been in. Some of that is really looking at how do we close the disparities that we have in our community, how do we target that, and the numbers that you've shown have shown where in general we're doing a good job, but there's some very specific areas in foster care and child abuse and mentoring in early childhood where we could be more targeted. I know that this was kind of a data on participation, and you also produce data on how well we're doing in those areas, so that's the other part of it. It's not just who we're serving, but how well we're serving them. And part of that goes back again to research that shows that when you offer culturally specific programming, you often get better results in recruitment, retention, performance, and whether it's through mainstream organizations that are trying to beef up their ability to provide culturally specific programming, or whether it's supporting culturally specific organizations themselves, which there are a lot of different ways to do that, and I think I applaud you for continuing to go in that direction. I think it's really important. I know that in the you ask that in the data in the proposals, and I think that's great. You ask who you're serving, who is making up the program staff, the management staff, the board. I applaud that. There were some proposals that came in and talked about we serve children with disabilities, but they didn't put down how many kids those are. So I would encourage that we do that in the next round. Is that if people say they're serving certain populations, I think that data really helps to support that rather than keep it general. East of 82nd has been a big push, and I'm sorry to see that we haven't gone as far. I think one example of why I would recommend not across-the-board cuts is because, for an example, Children's Relief Nursery opened a new relief nursery east of 82nd, and that's the kind of thing where we've tried to support what the data shows. We're going to be targeted in our servicing, and any kind of new operation with new infrastructure is at a fragile place and needs to be supported. And so that's the kind of thing where 23% across the board cuts doesn't make sense. So I hope that you continue going those directions. I have had my concerns about awarding 3 points for the two areas that we want to highlight, culturally specific organizations and East of 82nd. I was a huge supporter of that originally, and what I ended up feeling like happened is that when proposals came in and we gave the additional 3 points, then we still, which I think is important to do as an allocation committee, looked at the whole big picture and raised some organizations that had lower points over others, because we're saying points are not the only things that are important. And in some ways, the adding 3 points here and here kind of overly emphasize the point structure. And so I'm not sure that's one for you to wrestle with as you go back and look at how are you going to make your decisions. In some ways, I think it did a disservice, and we should just say, these are some of the areas that we really want to highlight, and not 3 points. Well, you've got 4 points, and I've got 3 points, and 2, Let me see if there's anything else. I also think that keeping a focus on prevention, again, the research shows that if kids enter kindergarten not ready to learn, that it's very hard to catch up. We need to provide the support early on so we don't start with those discrepancies. And we need to continue it all the way through, because research also shows if you let them fall off, you lose some of those gains. So I think continuing to make your decisions on best practices is important. I will say I was a supporter early on when I was on that side and on the side of making sure that we support the administrative overhead to up to a certain percent. We ended up going up to 15% if you could prove that that's really what you needed. And I do think it gets a little bit at the questions, Adrian, that you were raising about it's not just, can we serve 45 kids versus 60 kids? It's what can we do to really beef up our capacity as an organization to do good monitoring, good training of our staff, good board development, good collaboration with other groups in the community. And so I would encourage you in this era of cutbacks, not to reduce the capacity building of the organizations that gets at the quality, not just the quantity of number of kids served. And then lastly, the collaboration and systems change. We've focused a lot on giving grants to organizations and try to help them be the best they can be in serving the community. But we've also increasingly focused on building collaborations and systems so that if you're funding a lot of groups out there who are doing after school work, that you're also funding a system to support professional development in that field and best practices. And that helps the whole field move forward. So I think, I hope that you continue. I think that I've seen it change over the last few years, and I really applaud all of the changes and think that you can keep going. So again, I want to thank the committee and the staff and the grantees out there who are on the front lines working with kids every day, and the many applicants that applied that didn't get funding but are also out there every day. I think we are only able to fund 20% or so of applications, and I can't remember if that's number of groups or number of dollars, but I remember thinking that a few years ago. There's 80% of people in here that are not going to get funding who are working really hard as well. And lastly, I want to thank the voters for making this possible, and I certainly hope they renew it.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I will certainly miss you. I have thoroughly enjoyed working by your side, watching you just analyze, assess, bring forth your opinion. That, as Commissioner has said, you stayed up many of nights. I've been to her home, so and seeing.
You see, it's not cleaned up as a result.
So I, will miss you, but I know that this is not the last that we will see of you, and we know that you are going to continue to do your great work for the state of Oregon. So I just thank you for being my colleague and being by my side here.
Well, thank you again, Alyssa. And with that, we will close our last meeting of 2011. We have a meeting scheduled for January 26th, and it will be in the Multnomah County building. Staff will be sending out reminders and agendas for that next month. So until then, everybody have a safe and festive holiday and a new year, and we'll see you early in 2012. We stand adjourned.